cold river water dragged at his thighs. The current came down off the high snowfields, and it carried the bite of stone with it. He heard the whimper before he saw the shape. A small dark thing wedged between two cottonwood limbs out where the water turned white. He waded deeper. His old wool coat soaked black to the shoulders. A small paw clawed at his sleeve. Blood ran pink into the foam. The cub looked up at him with eyes that did not yet know what men were. He pried the iron jaws open with hands that had not been steady in a decade. The cub fell against his chest, and then he heard the pine boughs part behind him. Heavy, slow, deliberate. He did not turn yet. He already knew what was standing on that bank. Stay with me on this one. He had come to that valley because there was nowhere else left for a man like him. The high country above the Yellowstone in those years was a place that took men and did not give them back. Most who tried it died inside their first winter. Some died inside their first week. The ones who survived did so by becoming something quieter than they had been when they rode in. He had been quiet for 20 years now. He worked his traplines along the headwaters where the lodgepole pine grew thick and the elk came down to drink at dawn. He set marten in the high benches and beaver in the slow oxbows, and now and then a wolverine if the snow was deep enough to slow it. He sold his pelts twice a year at a small post run by a Norwegian who never asked him anything and never offered him anything beyond the going rate. He liked the Norwegian for those reasons. He lived in a cabin he had built himself with a single axe in the summer he turned 43. The roof was sod, and the walls were chinked with river clay and horsehair. There was one window of old paper and one door of split fir. Inside there was a stove made from a flattened steel barrel, and a bunk built into the wall, and a single chair he had carved from a windfall spruce. There was a small shelf above the bunk, and on that shelf there was a tin cup and a tin plate and a Bible that had belonged to his wife. He had not opened the Bible in 19 years. He kept it on the shelf the way a man keeps a stone in his pocket. Not to use, only to feel. He had been a different man once. He had been a man who whistled when he worked. He had been a man who slept hard at night and woke before the sun, and went out into the blue dark to break ice on the stock tank and rub the frost off the noses of his horses with his bare hand. He had lived in a sod house down on the bench country south of the river, where the grass came up to a horse's belly in good years, and where the meadowlarks woke a man at first light with a song that sounded like water running over small bright stones. He had run 100 head of mixed cattle, and had kept a small kitchen garden of potatoes and turnips and onions that his wife had tended in the long blue evenings. He had built her a porch on the south side of the sod house, and she had sat on that porch in the summer dusk with the boy in her lap, and she had sung to him in the low Welsh of her own mother. He had stood in the dooryard and listened to her sing, and he had thought to himself that no man living had been given more than he had been given. He had thought that, and he had been right about it. He had only been wrong about how long a man gets to keep what he is given. There had been a boy, 5 years old that summer. The boy had hair the color of wheat stubble and a habit of laughing at things that were not yet funny. He had been the kind of child who reached for a man's beard without fear. He had been the kind of child who went out before sunrise to look at the calves because he wanted to see them stand. It had happened in July. A boar Grizzly come down off the divide hungry and old and crippled in one hip. The bear had come into the dooryard at first light. The boy had been the first one out the door. The man had been still pulling on his boots when the screaming started. By the time he reached the yard with his old cap and ball pistol, there was very little left to do that mattered to anyone living. His wife had run out behind him with the boy's name in her mouth. The bear had turned. It had been over for her in less than the time it took for a man to draw breath. He had emptied the pistol into the animal's chest at 6 feet, and the bear had walked another 20 yards before it sat down in the timothy grass and died looking at him. He had buried them under a single cottonwood on a small rise above the creek. He had buried them with their hands touching, because the boy had always slept that way with his mother's hand around his small one. He had sold the cattle that fall to a Mormon outfit out of Bozeman for half what they were worth. He He had burned the sod house himself with kerosene and a torch, and had stood watching it until the last roof beam fell. Then he had ridden north with a pack mule and his rifle and a single chest of tools, and he had not come back down off the mountain since. He had not spoken his wife's name aloud in 20 years. He had not spoken the boy's name at all. He kept them locked in the back of his throat, the way a man keeps a coin sewn into the lining of a coat. He worked his lines. He smoked his pipe at dusk. He read the weather in the way the magpies flew. He slept with his rifle across the foot of the bunk, and he ate elk meat and trout and bannock bread cooked on the flat of a shovel. He had grown lean and gray and silent. He had grown into the mountain, the way an old tree grows into the rock it was born next to. He hated grizzlies. He hated them with a cold and patient hatred that did not require thinking about. When he saw their sign in the spring mud, he stepped around it. When he heard them in the brush, he did not run, and he did not raise his rifle. He simply stopped and let them go their way. He did not hunt them, and he did not shoot them. He had killed one bear in his life, and he had decided in the smoke of his burning house that he would not kill another. Not because he had forgiven anything. He had not forgiven anything. He let them live the way a man lets a debt sit unpaid, because paying it would mean acknowledging that it was owed. That was the man who walked down to the river that May morning. 62 years old. A face like a piece of weathered cedar. Hands knotted with old work. A long beard gone the color of wood ash. He had come down to check a beaver set he had laid the week before in a slow bend below the rapids. He carried his rifle slung muzzle down across his back, the way the old French trappers had taught him to carry it when he was a young man on the upper Missouri. He carried a skinning knife at his belt and a small hatchet in a sheath at the small of his back. He carried nothing else, and he expected nothing else. He had been thinking about the beaver set. He had been thinking about how the water had risen 3 inches in the night, and whether the trap would still be where he had laid it, or whether the chain had washed downstream into the willows. He had been thinking about practical things, the way he had taught himself to think about practical things for 20 years, because the practical things were a fence against the other things, and the fence had to be kept up every day or it would come down in a single afternoon. The sound that stopped him was not a beaver sound. It was high and thin and broken. It came from the white water above the bend. He stood still in the willows for a long minute listening to it, and his hand had gone to the rifle without him telling it to. He knew what the sound was. He had heard it 20 years ago coming out of his own dooryard. It was the sound a young thing makes when it is hurt and frightened, and beginning to understand that no help is coming. He had told himself over the years that he would never walk toward that sound again. He had told himself that he would walk away from it if he ever heard it. He walked toward it. He came out through the willows onto a gravel bar, and he saw the cub 30 yards upstream. It was caught in a tangle of cottonwood deadfall in the worst of the current. A small dark shape thrashing and going under and coming up. The water around it was streaked with red. He saw the trap on the bar above. An iron leg trap with a chain that had been pulled out of its stake. The cub had dragged it into the river, and the chain had snagged in the deadfall, and the iron was still locked on its right foreleg. He saw all of that in one long look, and then he was waiting. The water was snowmelt, and it took his breath. It came up to his belt, and then to his ribs, and the cold ran up into his chest like a knife sliding home. He kept the rifle high. He moved the way a man moves in a current like that, which is to say 1 foot at a time, with the upstream foot feeling for the bottom and the downstream foot bracing. He reached the deadfall, and he laid the rifle across the highest log, and he reached down into the foam. The cub was small. 6 months old maybe. 40 pounds soaking. It thrashed when his hand touched it, and then it stopped thrashing. It looked up at him with eyes the color of wet bark, and it made the small broken sound again, and he felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in 20 years. He worked the trap open with his left hand and his right wrist. The springs were old and weak from rust, and that was the only reason he was able to do it. The jaws came apart, and he eased the small bleeding leg out of them, and the cub did not bite him. The cub pressed its small, wet head against the front of his soaked coat, and it made no sound at all now. He lifted it. It weighed nothing. He waded back across the river with the cub held against his chest the way a man carries a child across a creek, and he felt the cold leaving his legs and going up into his stomach, and he did not care. He came out onto the gravel bar on the near side, and he knelt down. He set the cub on the dry stones. He pulled off his coat and laid it over the small body. He took his knife and cut a strip from the tail of his shirt, and he wrapped the bleeding leg, and he tied it tight enough to slow the blood and loose enough to let the foot live. The cub watched him the whole time. It did not whimper now. It only breathed. He saw that one of its ears was torn, and that there was a long shallow cut across its small shoulder where the trap chain had whipped it. He looked at all of these things with a craftsman's slow attention, and he did not yet allow himself to think about what was almost certainly coming through the timber on the far bank. The pine boughs moved. He heard them move before he saw anything. A slow, heavy parting of green branches the way a curtain parts in a doorway when something large pushes through it. He did not turn yet. He stayed kneeling on the gravel with his hands on the cub. He let his breathing slow. He let his hands stop trembling, which they had begun to do without his permission. He thought about the rifle, which was lying 10 feet away across the log on the deadfall in the middle of the river. He thought about the knife at his belt, which would be of no use at all. He thought about his wife, and he thought about the boy, and he thought about the morning 20 years ago when he had stood in the timothy grass with an empty pistol and watched a bear sit down and die looking at him. Then he turned his head and he looked across the river. She came out of the pines, the way where there comes off a mountain. She came out slow. She did not lumber. She did not crash. She walked. She was the biggest grizzly he had ever seen, and he had seen many. She stood 8 feet at the shoulder when she came up out of the brush onto the bank, and she was the dusty gold of late summer wheat, and there was silver in the long fur down her hump. Her head was the size of a barrel. Her paws, when she set them down, made small craters in the wet sand. She stopped at the water's edge. She looked across the river at him. She did not roar. She did not pop her teeth. She did not raise up on her hind legs to make herself larger, because there was no need to make herself larger. She simply stood, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. He did not move. He did not reach for the knife. He did not look toward the rifle. He kept one hand on the cub, and he let the other lie open and empty on his thigh, and he met her eyes across 40 feet of running water. Time did something strange in him then. The river kept moving, but the air did not. The wind that had been in the cottonwoods went still. The magpies that had been quarreling upstream went silent. He could hear his own heart, and he could hear the cub breathing under his coat, and he could hear the soft, wet sound of the great bear's breath coming and going across the river. Nothing else. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. He had thought he would feel hatred. He had carried hatred for 20 years, and he had expected it to come up in him now like bile when it was finally needed. It did not come. He looked at the bear across the water, and he saw an animal. He saw an old mother who had walked her cub up out of the high country to drink. He saw an animal that had smelled the blood of her young on the wind and had come down through a mile of pine to find it. He saw an animal that was looking at a man kneeling over her child and was deciding what to do about it. He did not see the bear that had come into his dooryard in July. He did not see the bear he had killed. He saw this bear. Only this one. And something in him that had been clenched for 20 years began very slowly to unclench. He thought of his rifle on the deadfall log. He thought of how a man could die between one breath and the next if a grizzly that size decided to cross 40 feet of river. He thought of all of that, and he set it aside. He set it aside the way a man sets aside a tool he has decided he will not need for the next piece of work. He spoke to her. He did not plan to speak. The words came up out of him, the way a spring comes up out of the side of a hill. He said, "Easy now." He said, "I have him." He said, "I have him, and he is alive." His voice was low and rough from 20 years of not being used much, and it came across the water without any heat in it at all. The bear's ears moved. One forward, one back. She took a step into the water. She stopped. She watched him. He kept his hand on the cub. He kept his other hand open. He said again, "I have him." He stood up slowly. He kept the cub in the crook of his left arm wrapped in his coat. He stepped down off the gravel bar into the shallows on his side of the river. The water came up to his knees. He took another step. The bear watched. She did not move. He took another step. Halfway across the cold water came up to his belt again, and he stopped. He set one knee down on the gravel of the stream bed under the water so that he was lower than her. He held the cub out a little. He said, "Here." He said, "He is yours." He waded the rest of the way across the river slow and steady. He did not look at the bear's eyes any more now. He looked at the small, wet head of the cub. He came up out of the water onto the gravel of her side of the bank, 10 feet from where she stood. He could smell her now. She smelled of pine pitch and wet earth and the deep sweet musk of a bear in spring. He could feel the heat coming off her body. He went down on both knees, and he set the cub on the gravel between them. He unwrapped his coat from around it. He stepped back one step. He stepped back another step. He stayed in the shallows of the river, with the water running cold around his ankles, and he did not turn his back on her. She came forward. She came forward one slow step at a time, and she lowered her great head, and she nosed the cub. The cub made the small broken sound again, and then it made a different sound that was not broken. She licked the torn ear. She licked the bound leg. She did not look at him. She did not look at him for a long time. The cub got up. It got up on 3 legs, and it leaned against her shoulder, and she stood over it the way the cottonwood had stood over the small rise above the creek, where he had buried his wife and his boy with their hands touching. Then she lifted her great head, and she looked at him. He saw her see him. He saw her recognize him as the thing that had pulled her child out of the river. He saw her decide. There was no other word for it. She made a decision in the way only old animals make decisions, which is without any wasted motion at all. She turned her head away from him. She nudged the cub with her nose. The cub limped a step. Then another. She turned her great body, and she walked it back toward the pines on 3 legs and her own 4, and she did not look back at him, and she did not need to. He stood in the cold river, and he watched them go. He watched the pine boughs close behind them. He watched the place where they had been, until he could no longer be sure which set of moving shadows had been bears and which had been wind. Then he turned around and he waded back across the river, and he climbed up onto the gravel bar on his own side, and he sat down hard on the wet stones. He sat there a long time. The sun came over the ridge behind him and warmed the back of his neck. His coat was still in the gravel where he had unwrapped the cub. He picked it up. There was blood on it. There was bear fur on it. He held it across his knees, and he looked at it, and he did something he had not done in 20 years. He wept. He wept without sound the way old men weep, when they have finally been given permission to weep by something they were not expecting. He sat on the gravel bar until the sun was high. Then he got up and he picked up his rifle from the deadfall, and he walked the half-mile back to the cabin. He hung the rifle on its pegs above the door. He did not check the beaver set that day. He did not check it for 3 days. When he did check it, he found a beaver in it, and he killed the beaver cleanly, and he skinned it, and he stretched the hide on a willow hoop, and he salted the meat for the smoker. He did all of this the way he had always done it. But something in him was moving now that had not been moving for a long time. He went back to the river, crossing the next spring. He went back because he could not stop himself from going back. He found the place on the far bank where she had stood. He found a single tuft of dusty gold fur caught on a low pine branch at the height of her shoulder. He took it down. He carried it home in the breast pocket of his coat. He laid it on the shelf above the bunk beside the Bible. He did not open the Bible, but he sat in the chair he had carved, and he looked at the shelf for a long time that evening, and he said his wife's name aloud for the first time in 20 years. He said it once. Then he said the boy's name. Then he said nothing more. In the fall of that year, he found a set of poachers' traps on the upper benches above the river crossing. Iron leg traps the size of the one that had held the cub. Set illegally for Grizzly. Set by men who knew the price a bear hide brought down in the railroad towns, and who did not care how the hide was got or what it cost the country to get it. He pulled every trap he found. He pulled them and he carried them down to the river, and he sank them in the deep pool below the rapids, and he did not tell anyone. He did this every fall after that for the rest of his life. He pulled traps. He cut wire snares. He found a poacher's camp once in a draw on the north slope, and he waited until the men were gone for the day, and he burned every stick of it. He burned the lean-to, and the smoke rack, and the small pile of bear scat samples they had collected to track the great gold bear up out of her summer range. He burned it and he walked away, and he never spoke of it. The poachers came back twice that fall, and twice more they found their work gone to ash, and at last they took their wagon down the river road and did not return. The old trapper did not see the great bear again in the flesh. He did not need to see her. He knew she was up there somewhere with her son, and that her son was now grown and had sons of his own, and that was enough. He saw their sign sometimes in the spring mud. A track the size of a dinner plate alongside a smaller one. He would kneel beside the prince and lay his hand flat into the great pad mark of the mother, and he would feel the cold, soft give of the earth, and he would stand back up and walk on without looking back. He took to leaving things at the river crossing. Not gifts. He would not have called them gifts. He left a cut of elk meat once on a flat stone above the high water mark in a hard February. He left a salmon he had speared in the fall run laid clean on the gravel bar where he had knelt that May morning. He never saw the things taken. He never saw them sit where he had left them either. They were simply gone in the morning, the way snow is gone from a south slope in March. He told himself the ravens took them. He knew the ravens did not take whole elk quarters off flat stones. He left the meat anyway. It was the only language he had left, and he used it as best he could. He grew older. His beard went from ash to white. His hands, which had never quite stopped trembling since the morning at the river, slowed a little more each winter. He set fewer traps. He read the weather still, and he read the sky, and he read the small print of mouse tracks across new snow, and he found in himself a patience he had not had as a young man. He spoke aloud sometimes in the cabin. Not to anyone. Only to the room. He would say the names. His wife's name. The boy's name. He said them the way a man says a prayer he has stopped believing will be answered, but cannot stop saying anyway because the saying is the prayer. He kept the tuft of dusty gold fur on the shelf above the bunk, and in the long evenings of his last winters, he would take it down and hold it in the cup of his palm and look at it by the orange light of the stove. He lived another 11 years. He died in the cabin in his bunk in the deep snow of a January night, with the stove still warm and the wind in the lodgepoles outside. The Norwegian found him in the spring when he came up to ask after a missing pelt order. The Norwegian buried him on the small rise behind the cabin under a young cottonwood the trapper had planted himself 5 years before. The Norwegian found the Bible and the tuft of dusty gold fur on the shelf above the bunk, and he did not understand what the fur was, but he laid both of them in the grave with the old man, because it seemed like the right thing to do. The trapper had left a single sheet of paper folded inside the Bible. The Norwegian read it because he could not help himself. It said only this: I pulled a child out of a river. A mother let me live. I owed her for 20 years, and she forgave me before I knew I was asking. Bury me facing the high country. That was all. The Norwegian buried him facing the high country. The cabin still stood for many years after. Hunters and trappers passing through would sometimes shelter in it during storms, and they would tell stories around the cold stove about an old man who had lived there once. Some said he had been a soldier. Some said he had been a preacher. Some said he had been a man who could walk among grizzlies and not be touched. None of them knew his name. None of them knew the woman he had loved or the boy he had buried in the timothy grass south of the river. None of them knew about a small cub bleeding in white water on a May morning, or about a great gold bear standing on the far bank watching a man decide which life he was going to live for the rest of his days. The story went into the mountain with him. It stayed there. The cottonwood on the rise behind the cabin grew tall. The wind moved in its leaves. The high country kept its own. And somewhere on a ridge above the headwaters of the Yellowstone, an old line of bears walked the spring snowfields with silver in the long fur down their humps, and they did not fear men. Not all men. Not the ones who had once knelt in cold water and held out what was not theirs to keep and asked for nothing in return.